Welcome to Biblical Viewpoints, a program brought to you by the Churches of Christ and dedicated to the restoration of New Testament Christianity. For over 30 years, it has been the intent of this program to uphold the Bible as the final authority in religious matters. You have heard man's viewpoints, but we invite you to open God's Word and join us as we search for the biblical viewpoint.
Well, Drew, we surveyed this whole long list of these heroes of the faith, and we're going to see today in this beginning in chapter 12, and again next week, there's going to be an athletic metaphor that's going to come in to play here.
Right.
You see that quite a bit. Paul does that a
Yes.
good bit. This might be another evidence that maybe he's the writer of this book, but we'll just leave that where it is for now.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, you're going to see the competition come down to the supreme runner, the supreme athlete. And it's like if you listen today, one of the things that people say about the greats used to be, whatever imagery they would use. Now they talk about how, this one's great and this one's great, but there are levels to this, and they're what they're saying is this guy here is on a whole nother level. He's just a cut above, and everyone else is trailing far behind, no matter how good they may be. So we're in this race, according to this, and we have a call to run it in a certain way, to run it with endurance. And so what we're going to see is this call to consider the cloud of witnesses that is around, and they're cheering you on, right?
Yeah,
they are urging you to continue in faithfulness. And I want to bring this back to the issue at hand. What are the Hebrews facing? What is the challenge that the writer is trying to address? Their legs are tired.
Yeah, that's right.
And you get in these long races like that, and I don't know if you've ever done a lot of running. I don't anymore. My ortho got me out of that one. He told me not to run unless something's after me. But you get tired, and it's hard to finish, especially when you think about Christianity. It's not a sprint. It's a marathon. And so as we get ready to look into this, remembering that list, they did great things. They finished their race, right? It was difficult at times. If you look at some of the names in there, they had failings. There were times they fell down on the track, didn't they?
Yep.
What did they do? Got back up, looked to the one that was ultimately cheering them on, the goal that they were striving for, and they finished, didn't they?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. With that in mind, let's go ahead and read 12, 1 through 3. This is Hebrews chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. We've just finished talking about Hebrews chapter 11 for a good little while. We've noticed all of these people, like Todd said, that we're running the race, but there is one who, as he said, is just a cut above, and his name, of course, is Jesus of Nazareth. Now, in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1, it says, "Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Fixing our eyes," verse 2, Hebrews 12:2, "on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." And then the writer reminds in verse 3, "Consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart." The first thing I'd just like to point out before we take a look at each of these passages in turn is that there is an athletic metaphor. In fact, this is something that was used at least in one passage in the Old Testament, in Psalm chapter 119, where the psalmist just simply praises the word of God over and over and over again for being what it is. He says in 119 and verse 32, "I shall run the way of your commandments, for you will enlarge my heart." So even in the Old Testament, this idea of running, and you can remember maybe some of those runners who maybe bore messages in the Old Testament, Asahel being one of those famous ones from the Old Testament, would carry a message and they'd bring it forth. And the idea of running was one even in the Old Testament that they used as a metaphor to show, oh, this is a striving for something, or this has a goal at the end of it. And we'll notice a number of those aspects here in just a moment. But even in the New Testament, when we open up, especially with Paul, the idea of a running or an athletic metaphor is strikingly prominent. And so in 1 Corinthians 9, he uses that kind of illustration. When you get to Galatians chapter 2 and verse 2, and then also Galatians 5 and verse 7, he talks about how they were running in the faith. And then you get to Philippians chapter 1, Philippians chapter 2, Philippians chapter 3, and he talks about their running in Christ. But perhaps in Philippians chapter 3, it's most prominent when he talks about he's aiming for the mark, or he's aiming for the goal that is set before him. And then in 2 Timothy chapter 2, of course, he talks about obtaining an imperishable crown, kind of the same kind of thing that he's talked about in 1 Corinthians 9. But then in 2 Timothy chapter 4, at the end of his life, he writes that he has finished his course. He's kept the faith. So when we think about the athletic metaphor and everything that Todd and I are about to talk about from Hebrews chapter 12, 1 through 3, and then next week from 4 through 13, Hebrews 12, 4 through 13, just remember that we're in the race of faith, and it's imperative that we don't give up, we don't lose heart, we don't lose our faithfulness, but we keep faith in Jesus Christ. And Todd, with that, we might turn to Hebrews 12 and verse 1.
Yes, there's some really key features that we're going to see here. And one of those being, as we're going to note first, we don't have to run alone.
Yeah.
And we're not running a race that nobody has run before. You know, sometimes it's kind of like when I was a kid, we used to go out and jump off the rocks into the creek. Well, you know, you needed somebody to go first, so you saw how that ended before you were willing to get up the gumption to go.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of what we're seeing here with this cloud of witnesses. And there's a couple different ideas that are in back of it. When you use the imagery in the Grecian times, the people in the stands looking out, cheering you on there. And then ultimately, though, you would be looking to the ruler who was ultimately the primary participant in that, the one you were seeking to please. So there's something that attached that image to it. Maybe there's something to that. But what we do know is that God is faithful, and we've seen it already with these who ran on in chapter 11. So let's turn and look.
Thinking about that for just a second, you know, Hannah and I have been watching the World Series. We're pulling for Rangers because Evan Carter's there.
Yeah.
And so we're really, really engaged in the series this year for sure. Really pulling for the Rangers. And we weren't Rangers fans until just recently, you know. Now we're pulling for them hard.
Us too.
And you think about the stadium there. So you've got that aspect. But then also they pull on these people on the camera, at least on television, and they say, oh, so-and-so's here and so-and-so's here. And they note these are former champions. And that's kind of like what you're talking about. You've got the spectators, but then also out there, they're bringing out before this next contest happens, they bring out a former champion, and that's Jesus. And the same kind of imagery here, which just spurs us on to do better.
Absolutely. And I think it adds to, he's not asking us to do anything that he hasn't done himself.
Right.
He who had the power to defeat all of those enemies very simply, very easily, takes one angel to kill 185,000 Assyrians at one point, yet he just stretches his arms out and allows himself to be brutally murdered because he knew what the goal was.
Yeah.
And he was willing to do that. So that's a good point.
Yes.
Very good point. All right. So the first feature that we see in Hebrews 12:1 is the idea of witnesses, those who are there in attendance, if you will. And I think he's looking back here to chapter 11 and all of those faithful martyrs at times, many who they overcame fantastic odds. I mean, things that would make most of us wilt under the pressure. And you have to wonder, how did they do all of that? Well, we've already seen that. They were looking for a city. They were looking for an inheritance, something that was beyond what they had there in the land. They didn't have the same worldly mindset that most people do. We live here in these bodies, in this world. We experience the creature comforts that we now have. We Americans have probably too much creature comfort. It's probably not conducive to our faithfulness. It may be that our overwhelming blessings are actually our greatest curse now, because it's hard for us to keep an eternal mindset when it's so comfortable here on this earth. And so we need reminded of these things. But we're in a race, and we're in a race that is long. It is one that requires endurance. And he says there are witnesses there in chapter 12, verse 1. So the question is, are these spectators like in a stadium, or are they people who are able to give testimony? A witness is one who testifies to what they have seen, what they know, that God is loyal, that God is faithful, that God is not going to let you down, that he is going to be there at that finish line when you cross it. And so therefore the race, with all of its agony at times, is worth it. The glory that is on the other side of it is worth it. And that's what was the catalyst for Jesus finishing his. He saw the glory that awaited And so he's going to make good on his promises. And so that's the first image. The second feature that we have is this baggage, this idea, if you notice there, therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight. Now this can be difficult. We all have things that are a hindrance to our walk with Christ, okay? There are things that are not in keeping with his will, and every one of us comes to him from different angles. Some people are raised up around his church, around his people, and they never venture that far off, so maybe they don't have quite as much baggage. Others are like myself, who went through all kinds of worldly ways before becoming a Christian at 21 years of age. I had a lot of baggage I had to let go of. You may be in either one of those camps or somewhere in between. But whatever the case may be, anything that hinders our ability to run this race faithfully, we have to shed it. We have to slough that off and get on with the race, because there's nothing more important in our lives. So what are our weights, our hindrances? I've already mentioned the ease with which we live our lives. If you go back to the parable of the sower, Matthew 13, Luke 8, there was one particular group there that was named, or type of soil that was named, where the seed went in and it grew up among the thorns. And the thorns wound up choking it out, even though it had sprouted. And it says there that it was the cares and the riches and the pleasures of this life is what that relates to. And so that could be one. It could be difficult things. Maybe we don't take those difficulties the way we ought to. That's why we need to look to Jesus, as we're going to see in a moment. The third thing we see here is the writer speaking of a race. And here it's a race that is run. It is something that is in front of them. Many times I fear we might become a Christian. We've obeyed the gospel. We have been buried with Christ through baptism into his death, raised up to walk in newness of life, Romans 6, 3 and 4. And maybe we think we can just sit down and go find our place on the bench and all is well. That's not the picture that is put before us here. It's a race that continues. We have to go all the way to the end till we cross the finish line. And so the question is, how are we running our race of faith? Have we given up? Have we decided to sit down and take our leisure for a while, maybe rest on our laurels? If we do that, we're either moving forward or we're going backward, Drew, and there's no in between. And so we have to lay aside anything that is going to hinder us. And if you go looking into the text more closely, that can be any number of things.
Yeah. Yep.
It could be pleasure, it could be pain, it can be family.
Yep.
That's a tough one for a lot of people.
Yeah.
I don't want to give up my family. They're my blood relatives. But we know from the picture in Matthew 22, when Jesus talks there to the Sadducees and he demonstrates their error concerning the resurrection and what things are like on the other side of this, neither married nor given in marriage. These type of relationships are going to be of a different sort. That can be unsettling to us, but we have to remember that we're going to be like him when we arrive there in a way that we don't understand now. And so it will be well on the other side. That's where the faith comes in, to trust him that it is indeed worth it to lay aside whatever is getting in the way of our race with him.
That's right. That's exactly right. Taking a look then at chapter 12 and verse 2, fixing our eyes on Jesus, he ran the race well, the best you could run it. And so in chapter 12 and verse 2, he's the author and the perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross. Now you might think, man, I thought I heard endure a couple of times in there. Well, you did. It's back in chapter 10, verses 32 and 36. It's in chapter 12, and you've got it there in verse 1. Let us run with endurance. Why? Well, Jesus ran with endurance, 12 and verse 2. He endured the cross. And then in 12:3, consider him who has endured such hostility. Jesus did. He endured the hostility by sinners. And then in chapter 12 and verse 7, next week we'll point it out again, but it is for discipline that you endure. And so endurance is a major factor in this particular analogy as he speaks to us about our running the race. This is no sprint. This is a race that demands endurance. I've got a cousin who loves to run marathons, and he's told me a couple of times where he's had to give up because he's getting about halfway through the race, and he said, things are just not feeling right today. And some of the times he's had more severe health issues than others. Sometimes it's just a little bit of an ache or a pain. He's able to go the whole way. But the point here in Hebrews chapter 12 is that we realize that this race of faith is one where we're going to have to maybe take a little bit to make it to the goal. And that sends us to a second point, and that is that there is a goal. In fact, in chapter 12 and verse 2, it says that the joy was set before him. The joy was set before him. Let's pick back up in Hebrews chapter 11 for a second, where their eyes were angled. In Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1, when the author kicks open this text, and he's talking to us about everything and everybody that lived by faith, he says in 11:1, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. That is not by the physical eye. But it also goes on to say in chapter 11 and verse 6 that we must look to God. We must come to God and we must seek God. Our vision has to be pointed the correct way. And so thinking just back about one of those examples, one of the specific examples, thinking of Moses in Hebrews chapter 11, he was camped out in Egypt. And here he was that could have been, I'm not real sure about the historicity that was going on there, but he could have been maybe even heir to the throne in Egypt. He's raised up in Pharaoh's daughter's house. And it says in Hebrews 11, 24 and 25, he despised all of that. He rather would suffer with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. And it says in Hebrews 11, 26, he considered the reproach of the Messiah, the Christ, greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he was, catch this phrase, looking to the reward. The reward that he was really looking at was in the distance. And he was able to see beyond Egypt to a greater something that God had promised. This is 11:27. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he, here's a word, endured as seeing him who is unseen. Now, if we think Moses did well, how much more Christ? And that's the point that Hebrews 12 is making. We've already talked about this great cloud of witnesses, but now we have Jesus, and Jesus has done it perfectly. Jesus is the one who, with the joy that was set before him, endured the shame and saw the goal, saw the finish line. The joy wasn't already experienced. It was on the other side. And the interesting little bit here that's going on in the text as well is that the joy wasn't the cross. The joy was beyond the cross. And Jesus endured the cross because he saw the goal of the joy that lay beyond. And he did it not only for himself, he did it for people like you and me. The joy was not a selfish endeavor. The joy was for people like you and me. And so when we think about people who maybe did redirect their eyes off of the Christ, I'm thinking of a couple specific examples. One of those being in Matthew 14. You'll remember that they're out on the sea. The storm is there. But Peter had just seen Jesus walking. Peter thought, I'll walk on the water too. And he starts to go under when he sees the waves. He sees the water, and he moves his eyes off Christ, and he starts to sink. And similarly, in Luke 9 and verse 62, Jesus had made a remark that there's not a single person who, putting his hand to the plow, can go out and work in the field and look back and still find himself accountable and responsible and appropriate in the kingdom of God. Where we put our vision in this race is absolutely important, because if we move our eyes off the finish line, endurance won't take place, our running won't be finished, and Todd, ultimately, will lose the race of faith.
That's right. Difficult times are ahead. There's no way around it. And that's the unfortunate reality of life in a fallen world.
Yeah.
Now, our atheistic counterparts would argue that's the reason that you should believe there is no God. The question then comes up, why do we care so much about it? I don't see a whole lot of depression and anxiety in the animal kingdom, do you?
No.
It just,
Yeah.
It just is what it is, and they
Right.
just go about their business, and they eat, and they live, and they die, and nobody really pays much attention to that.
Yeah.
They devour one another, and nobody's aghast that happens. But when people do it, we have a whole different, reasoning about that.
Yeah.
It feels different. It looks different. We know it's different, and there's something inherent in that. And so the fact that we have this sense that something's terribly wrong is really a much stronger evidence that God does exist, and that He has put His stamp in our hearts than that He does not exist. And so otherwise we would have no reason to be so concerned about this. But it's going to get tough. And so that calls our final point here in verse 3. It calls for endurance. And this is talking about bearing up under a weight. It's something that's not easy. And so I'm mindful of those who like to treat Christianity as a crutch for the weak, the things that it calls us to do and the way it calls us to react in these difficult times, even to those who are dead set against us. Love your enemies. Whoever said that? Jesus of Nazareth.
Yep.
And he meant it too.
Yep.
And he did it.
And I might add on that, when we do try, and the West has a real problem with this, when we try to transform Christianity into a health, wealth gospel, we've missed it badly.
Terribly. And it doesn't do anything for us in that, because what happens when the wealth and the health goes away?
That's exactly.
Everybody's going to lose their health at some point if we live long enough.
Yep.
Maybe you keep your wealth all through your life, but you can't carry it with you, and it's not going to buy you anything when you get to the other side. So, very good point. It gets watered down.
Yeah.
And really, we need these struggles.
Yeah,
right?
that's
why James says, count it all joy in James chapter 1, verse 2, when you fall into various trials, literally falling into them.
Yep.
You didn't see it coming. It just, whoop, here I am, and now I'm having a difficult time. Why? Because it produces endurance, which is exactly what we're talking about here.
Sir.
It's all in the mindset. So, the last thing we see here, the last feature in these first 3 verses, is the author's insistence on not growing weary and not giving up. And this is something that we need to keep in mind. But Alan Webster has a really interesting article about suffering and Christianity, and the title to that article is "Don't Pay the Tuition Without Receiving the Degree." And his point is you're going to have to pay the tuition of suffering and sorrow in this life. It doesn't matter how you live your life. There's going to be some of that. Different degrees for different people. And so why go through the suffering of that without receiving the degree, the reward for the suffering, that being eternity with God on high? And so here is a call for endurance again. Chapter 12, verse 3 says, "For consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls." And something I want us to ponder here for a moment, think about is, you and I, Drew, and every other human being walking this earth, we look at these things from a different vantage point. I have a horizontal view of mankind. We're all equal. I'm no better than anyone, and I'm no less than anyone. And so I have done wrong in my life. I am worthy of things going against me, okay, because of things that I have done in my past. Jesus was unworthy of any of that. He did not deserve the suffering that he endured. He took it upon himself freely for you and for me, so that we don't have to pay that ultimate price for our sins, which is death, separation from God for all eternity. Thank God for that. Thank the Lord that he came and did what he did. And so it's reminiscent of Galatians chapter 6, verse 9, where Paul says to let us not grow weary while doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart. Now that doesn't make it easy, okay? Nothing ever said it was going to be easy. You won't find a passage in the Bible that says it's going to be easy for us. The question is not a question of ease. It's a question of endurance and understanding the prize that lies ahead. We see, back to the athletic analogy that's being used, if you go and look at the things that go into athletic competitions, take football, for instance, my favorite sport, what those guys go through in order to be able to play that game, not just on game day. They talk a lot about straining, and that's you're worn out, you're tired, you don't want to go out there and crash into that 300-pound man across from you again. But guess what? You have to. The clock hasn't hit all zeros yet, and until it's done, you got to go out and you got to keep on doing it. And Drew, the ones who are able to strain and to push through that, they're the ones that come out on top in those games. But here's the thing: what are they fighting for?
Yeah, there's
a trophy. I don't know. I could tell you probably who won. I can tell you who won last year, maybe the year before, but I don't know what happened. I can tell you who won in 1998, being a Tennessee fan. Yeah. But other than that, I don't really know. I know who won entirely too many over the last 15 years.
Yeah.
But what is it? It's a piece of metal, and they'll go through all of that. Every year, it seems, there's somebody who dies on the field because it means that much to them. And here we are, fighting for something eternal that can't be taken away, of surpassing value. It's not even comparable. So we have to endure.
That's right. And that's Paul's point. In 1 Corinthians 9, they had the Olympics, Isthmian Games over there in Corinth.
Right.
And they would strive, Paul says, for a wreath that is perishable. They'd put it on the head, give the guy his toga and wrap him all up, and they'd give him the accolades. And he says, and for what? And he says, a wreath that's going to perish and wither away and die. And then he says, and what do you think these fellows who are non-Christians are thinking of us when we've been spouting off at the mouth about a crown of life and we're not running well for it?
Amen.
If we as Christians believe in a crown that's not perishable, then the way we run the race better well be to the finish.
Yeah.
And that's what he's talking about. So what have we learned today? 3 major things. Number one, we just talked about the athletic metaphor. It's one that Paul uses early on. Here I go. It may not be Paul, but maybe it is. If it is Paul, he's the one that uses it in Hebrews 12, 1 through 3. And that would be very much like him in his other epistles. The second thing we've seen is the athletic metaphors that have come out in this text, the witnesses, the weights or the endurance or the hindrances, the race, the endurance, the joy and the goal, and then also this call for no giving up. And so the question that remains here for us, if it is Paul that's writing to us, is he's wanting us to think again about that athletic metaphor. Think about how we're running our race, whether or not we've been faithful, whether or not we're still on the course and looking towards heaven.
What a great book, the book of Hebrews. We thank Todd and Drew for the outstanding job that they're doing in this book, and I hope that you, our viewers, are enjoying this book as much as I am. What a great book. When you look at the book of Hebrews, it begins like the Bible begins. It begins with God. So we have the great God of heaven, His communication, His fellowship, and His purification that He presents throughout this book, and trying to emphasize to Christians, don't turn back now. The best is yet to come.
Well, Todd, here we are in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 2, and he talks about sitting down at the right hand of God, talking about Christ, and the writer just can't stay out of Psalm 110, can he? He's right back to it. He emphasizes that Christ, after the cross, sat down. What do you make of all that?
Well, we're talking about endurance. We're talking about a race that's rough at times, right? We've pretty much, all of us have probably been through some long-lasting struggle. Maybe even thought, will this ever end? Will this ever be over? I'm so tired. I don't have anything left in the tank. I can't go any farther.
Yeah.
Can you imagine how Christ felt the day that he was taken to that cross? That scourging was enough to have killed him. They didn't even have to put him on a cross. He would have died that day. All of those things, bearing that cross, being on that cross, and it's just so wearisome. But he kept looking to God. He finished what he came to do, and then he sat down at his right hand. The point being, after the struggle was over, there comes rest, and how sweet that rest is when we're weary and we're tired.
We have heard the joyful sound.
Thank you for joining us today on Biblical Viewpoints. If you have a question concerning the things taught on this program, desire to enroll in our free home Bible study course, or have some other way we may assist you in your quest to know the truth, you may contact us at Biblical Viewpoints, 137 East C Street, Elizabethton, Tennessee, 37643. In the meantime, we encourage you to find a Church of Christ meeting in your community and worship with them. You will always find a hearty welcome and a group of Christians eager to serve you.